So we're really excited about today's conference for many reasons. Firstly, it marks the first time that Leap Sports Scotland has ever organised a conference, and the first time that we've ever come together in Scotland to look at these issues within the world of sport. Secondly, the issues that we're going to look at today have had a slightly higher profile in recent times, as a result of the Dutty Chan case going to the Court for Arbitration of Sport, due to the International Olympic Committee and their recent change of position in relation to transgender people competing in sport, and in relation to the very recent Westminster trans inquiry, which concluded that trans people are being unnecessarily excluded from sport at a recreational and access level. These are all issues which I think many of our speakers will probably be touching on today, and we're really excited to be having the opportunity to look at those in depth. We're also excited today because it marks the start of a new drive to raise the profile of the Euro Games. And we are trying to work with a number of partners at the moment to do some feasibility work because we're interested in seeing what Scotland thinks about bringing the Euro Games to Scotland.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the conference. We would like to take the opportunity to thank the Minister of Sport and the Sports Council of Scotland for their support of the conference and for the weekend. The European Gay and Lesbian Sports Federation was founded in 1989 with the aim supporting LGBTIQ clubs in Europe. Our main aim is to fight against discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation in sport. Nowadays, we have 151 organizations with 20,200 members. We are the license holder of one of the largest LGBTIQ European multi-sport tournament. This year, we are very excited to hold the Euro Games in Helsinki, Finland. End of June, beginning of July. We would like to thank Leap Sport for their hard work and the dedication they have shown to organize such an important conference. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Aneta. Many of you will know, of course, that Scotland played host to the Commonwealth Games here in Glasgow in 2014. We were exceptionally proud of our Team Scotland and all the athletes who turned up in record numbers and took medals in record numbers. I'm delighted to be introducing one of those athletes here today, who just also happens to be a Leap Sports Scotland patron. Martin was Scottish champion in 1500 metres freestyle and was British University champion in 1500 metre freestyle, 400 metre and 1500 metre short course champion. Martin has represented Team GB as well as Team Scotland at events and cup tournaments around the world.
Hello, good morning. I will be using some notes for a visual aid this morning. Please forgive me. This is due to the overwhelming feedback I've had at media training that I'm a terrible ummer. And by that I mean that I will fill every available silence with the word Welcome to Leap Sports Diverse Identities in Sports Conference. It's a privilege for me to be here today, not only because I was honoured when I was approached by Leap Sports last year and invited to become their first patron, but because as a Scotsman who's based in England, it makes me incredibly proud to come back to this country, which I call my home, that not only celebrates diversity, but that prioritises the rights of LGBT people in its political and social aspirations. I've done it like 4 times already. I really apologise. I came out publicly as gay during my final preparation for the Commonwealth Games in 2014. At that time, the response I received was almost entirely positive. In fact, I'd actually come out to my friends and colleagues within the sport several years before, and I don't recall ever experiencing a single incident of homophobia. I was fortunate enough to make that decision to be myself during an era when discrimination and bullying were almost unheard of, certainly within swimming. My brother is also an out gay man. He trained and competed at a national level as well. not to its highest standard, I would note. That was during the 1990s. The landscape of sport, even then, was one of misunderstanding, mistrust, and perhaps most importantly, for a young man finding his way in the world, isolation. Unfortunately, these are still challenges faced by broad sections of our LGBTI community every day, and I believe that those words that I just used may resonate with many in the room. Last summer, I toured 4 cities with an LGBT roadshow run by the ASA. The ASA is the governing body for swimming, aquatics actually in general, for England and Wales. Part of my role was to present the findings of an audit which they had conducted. This included several surveys and polls that were carried out by organisations such as Ditch the Label, Transsexuals in Sport, Stonewall, and various other LGBT organisations and charities. There were 1,098 respondents. Those individuals belonged primarily to one of the ASA's 7 registered transsexual swimming clubs or one of their 4 LGBT swimming clubs. While I am aware that this was an English study, I would like the opportunity to share some of the results with you today. The study found that the rate of negative experiences was consistently higher by a considerable margin in transsexual individuals participating in swimming. 26% of trans respondents reported having a negative experience due to the attitudes of customers in the changing area at sports centres and swimming pools, while 25% reported similar incidents on the poolside itself. The respondents of the survey were asked to identify some of the barriers that they feel prevent them from taking part in swimming specifically. Some of these I will list now. I'm anxious that people will make fun of me. I don't like shared changing rooms, and I don't want people to see me in swimwear. If I may, I'd like to compare these results to some of the responses that were gathered from gay men who were asked the same question. Their responses included, the facility needs updating, there's never any space when I go and swim, it's too crowded, and I've got no one to go with. For me, that shows that while equality has arrived for some factions of our community who are now free to be concerned about what I would describe as more trivial issues that everyone faces, it's still something that collectively we must fight for. I look forward to hearing from many of the wonderful speakers and workshop leaders that we have with us today. I certainly hope to learn a lot, and I hope that you have an entertaining day. Additionally, I was recently approached by Scottish Swimming, who have invited me to consult with them on their LGBT policy. I believe they're going to be putting together a film about what they intend to do in terms of creating a policy for LGBT athletes. I would love to use my question and answer session during the lunchtime to gather your thoughts on that, so that I can feed it back to them and together work with them to come up with an effective strategy. Thank you for listening. I believe I will now be handing over to our chairperson for the morning.
Now, Martin was one of our LGBT sports innovators for this year's LGBT History Month. And incidentally, and Martin mentioned this there are some tremendous optional extras for you today at lunchtime, and a question and answer session with Martin's one of them. We also have a session for LGBT History Month, where we'll be hearing some of the poetry of our one of our first national poet laureates, Edwin Morgan, who himself is a gay man, and it's very fitting that we end History Month with some poetry from Edwin Morgan in the Edwin Morgan Room, which is down at the other end of the theatre. So those are things which are happening over lunch that we'd like to invite you to take part in. Another one of our sports innovators is here today as well, and that person happens to be our chair for today. And I always feel exhausted by reading out Kat's CV. As well as being a doctor in the School of Gender and Feminist Studies at the University of Stirling, a Leap Sports board member and a committee member for the Scottish Queer International Film Festival, Kat has a previous life as a footballer, playing on scholarship in Connecticut, playing for the German women's football team, and currently is still one of the all-time top goal scorers for Glasgow City women's football team. So it's my great pleasure to finish speaking and to hand you over today to our chair, Katarina Lindner.
And the sort of general, I suppose, area that we'll be looking at in this first plenary session is both the Scottish context in relation to LGBTIQ issues in sport, and then we'll also, towards the end, look a little bit more at issues around sort of policies that Pat Griffin is going to talk to us about. So the list of speakers for this morning include Jamie Hepburn, which I'm really delighted to be welcoming to the stage to start off the session, the Minister for Sport, Health Improvement and Mental Health. Then we'll hear from James Morton, who's from the Scottish Transgender Alliance. And then there's an additional speaker that's not in the programme, as you have it in front of you, Sophie Cook from Bournemouth City FC, who's the first transgender woman in the Football Premier League in England. And then we'll close the first session with a talk from Pat Griffin from the University of Amherst, who I'm really excited to be introducing to the stage a little bit later on. So if I could ask Jamie Hepburn on the stage, please.
Next. I am very delighted to be here this morning at this important conference to discuss the important issue of tackling homophobia and transphobia in sport. And it's great to see so many folk along here this morning. These issues are not just seen in Scotland, but throughout the UK and the rest of the world. We have a number of attendees from out with Scotland today. I know that some of the speakers from elsewhere who you will hear from during the course of the conference today will highlight how they are looking to address attitudes in their respective countries. Let me be clear, as the Scottish Government's perspective, that there should be no barriers at all to participation in sport. Everyone should be able to participate in and enjoy sport, whoever they are and whatever their background. Scotland is a progressive nation in terms of promoting rights for LGBTI people. This was highlighted during the Glasgow Commonwealth Games with the success of Pride House. Not only did we see thousands visit Pride House, but it was the first time this had been seen at any Commonwealth Games, and I was delighted that the Scottish Government were able to provide funding and help make Pride House a reality. During the Commonwealth Games, my ministerial colleagues met with representatives from over 21 countries and used that platform to demonstrate human rights concerns, including around LGBTI issues, to also demonstrate our support. The rainbow flag was flown above Scottish Government buildings during the fortnight which the Games were on, very much taking the opportunity the Commonwealth Games afforded to raise these important issues. We're of course not stopping there, and are currently considering ways of creating a lasting LGBTI legacy. I certainly hope that this event today highlights some ways in which we can do this, and that Scotland can be a world leader in ensuring people playing sport are not impacted negatively by the views of others. I very much look forward to hearing any ideas emanating from this conference as to how we can be active in pursuing that end. Despite the progress made, though, I would recognise we still have far to go. The Equality Network's report in 2012, Out for Sport, revealed that 73% of respondents consider discrimination as a barrier for LGBTI people participating in sport. This figure is, of course, unacceptable, and we are taking action with our partners to ensure that we can greatly reduce that figure. Following on from the Equality Network's report, Sport Scotland also commissioned a report into equality in sport, which was published on the 27th of January of this year. Some of the findings in that report focused on the barriers people felt stopped them participating in sport. These barriers included lack of self-esteem and body confidence, attitudes of others, and the influence of family and peers. A lack of education and awareness were highlighted in the report, and Sport Scotland will be working with the sports governing bodies to see how attitudes can be changed by working from the top level all the way down to coaches and clubs. However, the sports governing bodies and Sport Scotland cannot achieve this on their own. They cannot do it on their own, and they will be working with various partners, including LEAP, of course, to assist them to reflect on the issues raised and to prioritise the actions that need to be taken. The Equality Standard for Sport provides an opportunity for governing bodies to consider equality in all their functions and services and all that they do. As a minimum, investment requirement. All sports are required to have an equality policy dependent upon their investment level, capacity, and resource governing bodies are also required to engage with a specific level of the standard. Sport Scotland supports governing bodies who are working towards achievements in the standard. This approach will ensure that the consideration of LGBTI people will be mainstreamed through their sport development plans and in accordance with existing equality legislation. In order to continue raising the profile of the LGBTI community, LEAP have produced a video which I understand will be played for the first time later this morning. I'm sure that this film will provoke and inspire a discussion to improve sporting opportunities for transgender people and can be used as a tool to highlight issues amongst the wider population. And unfortunately, due to other commitments, I'm unable to stay for the duration of the entire conference today. However, the workshops on offer this afternoon are wide-ranging, and I very much look forward to hearing the outcomes from these and working together with LEAP, with others in this room, to ensure that there is a level playing field for everyone who wants to participate in sport. That is our collective aim, and it's one I'm determined to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me to speak. It's been a great honour to work with LEAP Sports on developing the conference programme and on the transgender film that's going to launch this afternoon, well, this morning. It's really exciting about the film because it follows a number of really inspirational sports people who happen to be trans. And it's felt really emotional to actually listen to some of the speeches earlier, because Martin, for example, spent the vast majority of his speech talking about trans issues. He didn't have to do that. He could have talked about gay and bisexual men's issues in sport. But we have these amazing allies now. And LEAP Sports Scotland, Caledonian Thebans, Glasgow Frontrunners, a whole load of others have all been doing great work for many years on including trans people in sport. But it's still actually relatively recently that trans people's social inclusion has improved in any significant way. It was 15 years ago that I transitioned, and at that point there's very little in terms of legal protections from service providers or employers. There was no right to change your name, no right to change your gender on your birth certificate at that point. It's only just over a decade ago that we were able to get legal recognition of our genders. So sports felt like a very distant prospect for change. There were so many other fundamental issues that transgender people were facing, and we still face, such as healthcare rights and ensuring that we don't remain unemployed or underemployed. But sports is so essential. In the 2012 UK Trans Mental Health Study that we conducted at the Scottish Transgender Alliance, mental health issues, depression, anxiety, were really high and prevalent among trans people. And this was due partly to people's stress in terms of accessing gender reassignment transition, but it was also due with social attitudes and the exclusion that they felt. And one of the things that we know really improves mental health is physical activity. So being able to engage in sport is actually really essential to the well-being of trans people. I remember myself stopping swimming after being quite a good competitive swimmer in my childhood. I stopped swimming when I reached puberty because I could no longer get away with just wearing trunks. I was now going to have to wear a female swimming costume, and that was something that I just couldn't bear to do. I couldn't bear to wear that costume and have people see my changing, developing body at puberty. So I stopped swimming, and I didn't start swimming again until my mid-20s. And I only did that because I had to lose weight in order to get access to surgeries. And I felt like there was no choice but to go through jogging and swimming and attempt to improve my health. And it was really daunting to do that. There was so much staring and so much hassle about trying to get into the changing room. And I'm not the only trans person who's experienced that and still does. So it's so essential that sports bodies, that sports clubs, that our allies help us push for the right to access the changing room that accords to our gender identity, that we don't have to prove that we've reached a certain stage of transitions physically. There should be adequate privacy in changing rooms so that we can all get changed in safety and comfort. We need to make sure that people are addressing their policies around which gender, sex segregated sports we can participate in. Sometimes people get very stressed out about whether or not trans people have had hormones or surgeries just in order to be able to take part in a fun run, or to be able to turn up to your local tennis court and play a game. We need to make sure that we're looking really proportionately at what level of evidence is needed to allow someone to participate. It's really positive that the International Olympics Committee has now put out new guidance and recognised that requiring surgeries for enable trans women to participate as women is completely unnecessary. So thank you very much for coming here today. Thank you very much for being part of the change for transgender inclusion in society and in sport particularly. It's been great to not have to quote loads of stats because people have already done so. If you want to read the full Out for Sport report, there's a transgender specific part of it as well as a full report. You can do so at the Equality Network website, equality-network.org. That's the parent organisation in which the Scottish Transgender Alliance is part. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone. I'm Sophie Cook. I'm the club photographer for AFC Bournemouth, who are a Premier League football club now. At the end of last season, we got promoted to the Premier League. I'm a lifelong Bournemouth fan. We were always 3rd or 4th division. We were always on the verge of going out of business, going out of the Football League, and there we were. We're on the verge of getting promoted to the Premier League. And I'm stood on the pitch at Charlton Athletics Ground in the Valley as we're crowned Football League champions. And I'm being sprayed with champagne by players. I'm right at the centre of the celebrations. And it's the greatest day in the history of my club. And yet I was terrified. I was terrified that I would never ever work in football again. I was terrified that that was my last ever football match. Because I knew that during the summer, I was going to tell them that I was transgender. Things I've known I was transgender since I was 7. And because of that, I spent a whole lifetime suffering with self-harming, suicidal feelings. And this fear just started to control me. It controlled everything that happened in my life. Every time I thought something good was happening, I would self-sabotage it and just make sure that I was actually in pain. I needed to be in pain all the time. I had an amazing family, beautiful wife, 3 great kids, granddaughter. And I was terrified. I was terrified that I would never work in football again. I was terrified that I would lose my children. I was terrified that my whole life would just be destroyed. But it came to a head last January when I had a choice. I either changed something or I ended something. And I chose to change. Now, I told the football club during the summer. I moved to Brighton in June, and I was sort of leading a bit of a double life at the time. I was Sophie in Brighton, and then Steve when I went back to Bournemouth, taking my wig off. I mean, they noticed I'd lost loads of weight, and I was suddenly looking happy, but sort of no one tweaked why. And then I had hair extensions done, and it's like, oh my God, I can't just take this off and go back and pretend anymore. So I had to tell the club. And it was great. I went in for a meeting with the chairman of the football club and the manager and the commercial director and head of media. Sat there in the owner's box, overlooking the pitch. All the big wigs at the club, and me in my pencil skirt and heels, looking absolutely fabulous. But it was the first time they'd ever met Sophie. And the thing is, they had no idea what to expect. They had no experience of a trans woman. And their experience and their thoughts were probably based on the sort of rubbish that you see in the media. So I went and met them, and it was great. I still had a job, which was a bonus. And Eddie Howe, our manager, future England manager, you heard it here first. I shouldn't say that in Scotland, really, should I? He said, is there anything I can do to help? And I said, I really need to meet the players before a match day, because we need to get any perceived weirdness out of the way so they can see that I'm still me, just a happier version of it, obviously more fabulous. So I went in for a training session, and all the boys are off warming up over the other side of the training pitch. And he comes up to me, and Eddie says to me, So you're scared? And I went, you know what? I'm so at ease with who I am, so confident in who I am, but no, I'm not. So they called all the players together, and we'd already decided banter was the way to do it, keep the relationship on the same sort of footing it was before, and also to let them know they didn't have to walk in eggshells around me. So they called all the boys together, and our assistant manager said, so boys, you might have noticed our photographer's changed a bit since last season. Growing her hair out, I said, yeah, it's a bit away. I'd like you all to meet Sophie. And then our captain started clapping, and all the rest of the players joined in. And then the captain just turned around and said, right, let's go and train. And I built this up so much in my head. It's like I've been robbed of my moment. How was that it? And it's like, but it was just, right, here's the information, now let's just move on. And a few of the new players came, Sylvain Distin came to me and went, hello, I'm Sylvain. I went, hello, I'm Sophie. But it was great, and I spoke to a load of the players after the training session and told them my story. I told them about the self-harming, I told them about the suicide attempts. Because it was really important to me that they knew this wasn't a whim, this was saving my life. So of course I was terrified. I spent my whole life living in fear. Fear that I wouldn't work in football, and what's happened since I've come out has been amazing. I'm here today, I've spoken at Wembley Stadium, I've spoken at Anfield, I'm speaking at the Emirates in a few weeks' time. So far from my life in football being over, it's been enriched. And the thing is, the thing that I was really scared of, the most important thing in my life, my family, my kids, has also been enriched. Because all of those years I spent as a shell of a person who was terrified and like a zombie. There was just no emotion in me at all. My relationship with my kids is better than ever now. My 15-year-old son who's disabled, the first time he ever met Sophie, went, you look weird. It's like, thanks mate, way to make a girl feel special. And then there was another time where we were at the back garden, he's leaning over the fence and the neighbours going, Daddy's a lady. Sorry, they knew he wasn't outing me. But, and my 12-year-old daughter, who's like the most important thing in the world to me, now just every time I go back to visit, just, right, what's in your makeup bag? It's like exactly the same as there last time I came. It's like, I'm not 12. I haven't got 200 drawers of makeup like you have. But I was terrified of losing her. And my daughter summed it up for me when she commented on one of my Facebook posts, and she said, you're my hero. Steve was great, but Sophie's better. Thank you very much. You should all be proud of who you are and live your life, because there's happiness and joy on the other side. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I am based at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and I love to come to Scotland. I have Scottish roots, and actually found the graves of my great-great-grandparents in Newton-on-Ayr, which is a little bit south of Glasgow, a few years ago when I was visiting. So it's always fun to come to part of my homeland. I'm going to talk to you today about transgender. You can flip to the first slide. Including transgender people in sex-separated sports. And next slide, please. Basically, I want to talk a little bit about some of the current concerns and challenges that we've run into in the States, in particular, with trying to implement transgender inclusive policies, policy development, and educational challenges, and then look at some of the resources that are out there. Next slide. Some of the concerns that we run into when we're talking about transgender inclusion include these. I'm sure there are many that are familiar to you. You probably run into them as well. Concerns about competitive equity, competitive safety, safety in the locker rooms, access to locker rooms and showers and toilets, and you can see the difference, the challenges there. I think none of them will be a big surprise to anyone. One of the things that I find always interesting in sport is that we often traditionally have divided sport along a gender binary, and so it creates a big problem for us when we're talking about how do we include people who don't fit easily or at all into the gender binary. So we sort of start from a place that's created problems, and that's what makes it so complicated for us, I think, in sports. Next slide. And in addition to that, there are all these underlying gender narratives, I think, that sort of color people's interpretations and how they think about transgender people in sport or gender in sport in general. And so part of our challenge is challenging some of these very complicated and deeply embedded gender narratives. And I've tried to name several that I've run into that create some of these issues that are, as I call them, sort of broad cultural gender narratives that we run into, certainly in the United States, working with coaches and athletes and so on. Next slide. And then there's also the underlying contradictions. And as I said, because we've organized sport according to the gender binary, it kind of, in some ways, pits interests of different people in sport against each other. So on the one hand, I think particularly when we're talking about male to female transitions, people who are supporters and defenders and advocates of women's sports, and I certainly count myself among those people because I've been an athlete, I've been a coach, and am committed to expanding women's opportunities in sports. Sometimes it sort of gets framed as an issue of protecting women's sports and at the same time trying to increase access and inclusion so that transgender women can also participate in sports according to their gender identity. But so these are some of the complications that we deal with, and I think it's important for us to name and to get better at addressing these underlying issues before we can even begin to have a really informed conversation about what is good inclusive policy. And not just with other people, within ourselves too. Because every one of us grows up learning about gender, according to the social messages that we get about gender. And so we need to challenge these in ourselves as well as being able to work with the other people in sport that we're trying to talk to about creating inclusive policies. Next slide. So some of the range of ways that policies have been sort of presented in terms of addressing inclusion of transgender people in sport. One is there are some people who advocate just doing away with gender as a division in sport, just have open competition. Another policy recommendation that some people make is to create a completely separate category for transgender people in sport, so that transgender women would have their category, transgender men, and then cisgender people, men and women, would have the categories that have existed for a number of years. And then the third, which is probably the one where we've had most of the action in terms of trying to create policy, is to maintain gender-separated sports, but try to working within those boundaries, trying to create inclusion. And so that's where I'm going to spend most of my time. But the implications of the first one would be that there would be no categories. Next slide. Oh, and also, back on that last one, maybe sport would be organized in ways like wrestling, for example, by weight or height or some other characteristic, physical characteristic, would be the separating point for how people are divided up for competition. The other, in terms of dividing according to cisgender and transgender, would look something like this. You would go to a sporting competition, and these would be the 4 categories of competition that you might see. And then the next slide. Again, the range of policies that I think we've seen out there range from the former IOC policy. I put that in a different color to sort of highlight the fact that that's no longer the IOC policy. It's true, the IOC they were groundbreaking in terms of creating a policy back in 2004. The problem was it was a horrible policy. And what has come out of that is there are other, both international and national sports organizations that adopted the IOC policy and still have that policy and I'm hoping that they'll be changing now that the IOC is policy, but they're still out there. So I know the USA Track and Field, the US Golf Association, and some other governing bodies, certainly in the States and internationally as well. This is the old IOC policy is still their policy, which requires not only surgery, but evidence that you've taken hormones for at least 2 years, you've been able to change all of your official identity documents. It was really a transgender exclusion policy rather than an inclusion policy. And then the second broad category of policies that we see are the ones that I call hormone-based policies. And they also usually require prior documentation. The NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, which is the governing body for collegiate sports in the United States, has adopted this kind of a policy. And the IOC, in revising their policy, have sort of come back to a policy that's very similar to what has been the NCAA policy recommendation. So according to this policy, you get to play according to basically the level of testosterone that you have. So if you are a transgender person and you're not taking hormones, then the requirements are different for men and women. So a transgender man who is not taking hormones cannot compete on a women's team without changing. I'm sorry, a transgender woman cannot compete on a women's team without changing that team to a mixed gender team, which has implications for what kind of championships you can participate in. A transgender man, on the other hand, who is not taking hormones, can continue to compete on a women's team or compete on a men's team. For people who are taking hormones, if you are a transgender woman, you have to wait for 1 year of taking hormones before you can compete on a women's team. And for a transgender man, if you are taking testosterone, you may no longer compete on a women's team, but can compete on a men's team. So it's a little complicated, but it's all based on basically hormone levels in order to determine where you get to compete. And then there are other policies which require self-declaration prior to competition, and you must provide your documentation prior to the competition. And there are several high school associations in the United States that have started adopting this policy. So if you are a transgender young person, you want to compete in a high school sport, and it's state by state, which also means that we have a range of high school policies. Since we have 50 states, many states don't have any policy. And the ones that do range from really good policies, which are very inclusive, to others which are on the surface inclusive, but have exceptions. They leave a case-by-case exceptions, which I'll talk about in a second, to ones that are pretty exclusive, some that even require surgery, like going back to the IOC policy. So they're all over the place. But it is, you can compete in this policy with many of the high school policies with prior documentation. Also the U.S. Soccer Federation, this is their policy in the States. And then there are now emerging policies where you can compete according to your gender identity with documentation that is only required upon request. So, as with any competitor in a competition, if you're transgender, you would sign up for the sport that you want to play according to the gender identity that is your gender identity, and that's the end of it, unless someone challenges. Of course, the problem with this is that if there's going to be a challenge, you don't want it to happen in the middle of the competition. So again, even with that liberal policy, sometimes that can be a problem. Now, the World University Games in Miami in 2017 has adopted what I think is a great policy, which is basically a policy of self-declaration. All athletes present identity documents, not just transgender athletes, but everybody presents documents that documents age, gender, and so on. And that's the end of it. If there's a challenge, then you need to be prepared to present additional documentation. But it's probably one of the more liberal policies in terms of international sports that I've seen so far. So I recommend that you follow up on that and check it out. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, some of the policies that we've seen in the States, particularly at the high school level, they're inclusive in that they say that you can compete according to gender identity, but then they leave all kinds of outs, unless the governing body of the sport believes that there's some kind of competitive advantage in allowing this particular athlete to participate according to their gender identity. Or they believe there's some kind of safety issue in competition because of this particular athlete. Or they believe there's some kind of issue around privacy or safety in the locker room. So in some states in the U.S., they start out sounding really inclusive until you read the fine print. They leave themselves all kinds of outs. And often those decisions about whether or not there's an unfair advantage or a safety issue is left
to the discretion of people who don't really understand transgender identity. They're working out of all those gender narratives that I mentioned before. Okay, next slide. One of the things that I think is important for us to do is to challenge the idea that there's a one-size-fits-all way to approach transgender inclusion policies. I think there's a lot of factors that need to be taken into account. So there's a big difference if we're talking about the Olympics or NCAA competition, big-time Division I sports in the United States, versus recreational sports or children's sports, for Pete's sake, particularly children who are pre-puberty. Why can't everybody participate according to their gender identity? There's absolutely no reason why not. So it's really important for us to think about when we're making policy around transgender inclusion is to make sure that we're taking into account what are the goals. Are the goals of our organization inclusion and participation rather than winning a gold medal at the Olympics? We need to take all of those factors into account when we make a policy. So I think probably we will see policies that look different according to what kind of organization we're working with, and the age and the developmental levels and the competitive aspirations of the athletes who are competing. And that makes sense. Next one. One of the things that I wanted to recommend for an organization like LEAP or any kind of adult recreation level organization which is really focused on inclusion and participation, getting people involved in sport, is to really think seriously about adopting some kind of a policy that requires prior documentation for all athletes, with further documentation only if it's requested. And this is the policy, basically, that the World Out Games in Miami has adopted and will use for the Out Games. And I think it's a good one. I think it's really thoughtful. They've taken time to kind of look at what's out there, look at the pros and cons of some of the policies that have been recommended, and to make a policy that is inclusive, takes the burden off of transgender people to have to prove that they have a right to compete in sport. And at the same time, you require some documentation, and I love it that they're asking all athletes in the beginning to show identification, so that you're not just asking one class of athletes to demonstrate that they have a right to participate in the categories that they want to participate in. Next slide. Some of the challenges that we found working with sports organization coaches and administrators in the United States, and clearly there is such a lack of information about transgender identity, period, before we even begin to start talking about sports. Every presentation that we make in the States, we start with 101, defining what is transgender identity, what is gender identity, what is gender expression, and what's the difference? How is gender identity different from sexual orientation? And so until we can get past that conversation, we can't even talk about policy. And it's frustrating, but it's necessary at this point. There are so many myths and fears, which I've already talked a little bit about some of them, in terms of trans participation, what it means not only in terms of competition, but in terms of safety. I mean, we're having a huge issue in the States right now. It seems like one of the emerging problems in terms of the political right wing in the United States is they've decided to attack transgender access to bathrooms and locker rooms. And it's starting to manifest itself in political leaders in some states attacking inclusive transgender athlete policies at the high school level. So that, even to the extent of trying to pass laws that say that you can't use the bathroom according to your gender identity. You have to use a bathroom that matches your biological sex. Now, how this is going to be enforced is going to be real interesting. So far, it hasn't actually passed in any state. We've walked right up to that threshold, like in South Dakota is the most recent one. But there are others that are proposed. And it certainly is going to affect inclusion policy in terms of what teams young people get to play on. So these are some of the challenges that I find. Another one is reactive. This is a big problem in both college and high school in the United States. Athletic directors, they see these policy recommendations, for example, from the NCAA, and they think, oh, we don't have to deal with that. And they wait until a transgender student is knocking at the door and saying, I want to play on this team. And they're completely unprepared, and they're making decisions in reactive crisis mode rather than being proactive and thinking it out. And what that does, of course, too, is that I think most transgender people, just like all other people who want to play sport, they want to play sport. They don't want to necessarily be a pioneer or be in the public eye. And so if they know that that's going to fall on them because their school has not developed a policy, it discourages them from even trying. So we have a lot of challenges in trying to address these issues. Next slide, please. And then there's the whole emerging challenge of students, transgender students, and adults who identifies agender or non-binary or genderqueer, and they don't identify with this gender binary that we've used to organize sport. So the emerging challenge is, where do these young people get to play, or where do these adults get to play? And that's, I think, an emerging challenge that we are now starting to have to deal with at the same time that we're still trying to create gender-inclusive policies for transgender people. Next slide. So a couple of resources to end. One is, it's getting old, but there's still good discussion in there. It's on the team. We had a think tank in the United States in 2009, I believe, talking about transgender inclusion, and made some policy recommendations that came out of that think tank. And so this is still a good resource, but because the landscape for transgender inclusion is changing rapidly, some of the stuff in here is out of date, but I still think it can be useful. Next one is the NCAA Inclusion Guide, which was based on the Team Guide. This guide is in the process right now of being revised. So if you go to their site and get a copy of this, just know that in the next few months they're going to be coming out with another guide which is updated. Their basic policy recommendations have not changed, but they have updated the language, included some other issues that need to be addressed as we learn more. Next slide. A wonderful website, which is run by Chris Mosher, who is a trans athlete in the United States, a triathlete and activist and educator, and he has collected probably the best collection of resources on transgender policy any place that I've seen. So that I totally recommend Chris's website to you. Next slide, please. Again, Helen Carroll and I have done a lot of the work in the United States on trying to develop policies and working with high schools and colleges in particular. This is our email address, Helen's and mine. Helen works with the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which does a lot of legal work on behalf of transgender people gaining access to sport. And my thing is education. So together, we always talk about being the frickin' frack. If you don't do what you're supposed to do because you've been educated, then you're going to have to talk to Helen about breaking the law. So I recommend, if you want to follow up on any of this, those are how to get in touch with us. And I believe my time is probably up. And I don't think we have time for questions and comments, but I will be here all day, and I would love to talk to anybody who would like to talk about anything I said in my presentation.
Thank you. Great presentation, Pat. Leviathan Hendricks from the Federation of Gay Games. That model that you sort of proposed, well, it wasn't necessarily a proposition, but okay, thank you, of a sort of four-gender area competition with trans men, trans women. Do you think that the emergence of a lot of sort of perhaps like trans-specific swimming groups, and in London now we've got Gendered Intelligence has put together a casual football thing for trans people, that will lead to sort of that model taking shape? Any comments on that?
I don't think so. I think it's wonderful, though, to have those sport clubs. Because I think, as with any group who is targeted by social injustice, it makes sense to have that kind of support and place where you can be completely free among people whose identity is similar, if not the same, as yours. So, you know, it's the same reason why I've always supported women's groups or people of color gathering in groups to sort of, it's not only for self-affirmation, but it's also, there's a political purpose to being able to join together with people who are like you. Having LGBT groups, even though within that group there's a broad range of diversity. And so I see great value in having those kinds of sports clubs. I don't think it will necessarily lead to that kind of model, and I'm not sure I think it should. I think that model is impractical, actually. What I hope it leads to is more empowerment among transgender athletes, more of a sense of, I need this, I have a right to this, and I feel good about advocating for this, and that I hope that all cisgender athletes and people in sports will support that model, and at the same time, support more inclusion in LGBT sport leagues or mainstream sport leagues.
Another idea is to add, so my football club, we joined a five-a-side league, and we asked, is it mixed gender and can our trans players come? Whether or not our trans player does want to play, it's good to...
That's a great thing to do, I think, as a cisgender ally or ally organization, is ask that question.
Hi there, I'm Torsten from League. Kind of off the back of that question, I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts a little bit more around non-binary identities and what is the future for non-binary identities in sports, because clearly they do throw up a really huge issue from a participation perspective. Speaking for myself, I'm non-binary and I'd like to be able to actually compete in sport and have my identity recognised, and I encounter problems. So for example, there's a race which I'm entering at the moment, they're not sure where they're going to put me, not sure that I can compete. It just throws up huge issues, and I kind of feel that a lot of the time the discourse that we actually have is very much a discourse on a binary perspective, and we're not really engaging with the meat that we need to basically engage with.
I couldn't agree more. And as I said, I think part of the roots for that limitation in our conversation so far is that sport is divided, traditionally on that binary. I can only, because this is an issue for me too, is trying to work and try to figure out, how we can be inclusive if we're going to continue to divide sport based on gender. And I know that in the NCAA, they're starting to have this conversation, and hopefully will include some recommendations in the revision that I referred to. And I don't have an answer. I mean, I'd love to talk to you about it, actually, to get your thoughts on it, because when you're balancing so many things, as I mentioned earlier, one of the primary things that I can say is that depending on what kind of an organization it is, if you're talking about an adult recreation organization, I believe people should be able to compete according to their gender identities, and we should make room for that. Non-binary people should be able to compete where they feel that they're most comfortable. Because I think that for those kinds of organizations, the focus is on inclusion and participation. I may have a different answer if you're talking about the NCAA competition, because I know that within the structures of the NCAA and the limitations that they have to think about other factors in terms of developing a policy. But it's a great question, and it pushes all of us.
What we'll have now is, as I said, a world premiere of Lucy Holmes Elliott's film, Let Me Be Brave, which was put together with very generous funding from Sport Scotland. So we want to thank Sport Scotland for their financial support for the film. And what we'll do now, we'll show the film, which is about 10 minutes long, I think. And then we'll have a short panel discussion afterwards, which will include Lucy, who's the filmmaker. It will include two of the people who you'll see in the film. We'll have Chris Robertson from Sport Scotland, and we'll also have Jazz Sandu from Glasgow Live, who will all be commenting on the film and also respond to any questions.
People's experiences and stuff like that in Scotland. It kind of just went from there, and then Hugh got hold of some people and just got in contact and stuff like that, and then just went round Scotland meeting the different people and filming everyone and stuff like that. I didn't really want to kind of do just kind of like a kind of talking heads thing where it's just like one person, then another person, then another person just sitting down the entire time. So I didn't actually plan the interviews very well. I just ended up talking to everyone for about 2-3 hours, which I'm really sorry about. But and then just kind of pieced it together afterwards, just from what people kind of said or anything, instead of kind of giving questions that were kind of putting answers in people's mouths and stuff like that. But yeah, it was really enjoyable, and it was really amazing meeting everyone, and it was really, really cool. Great. Something about what it was like being part of the film, why you thought it was important to be part of it, what you enjoyed about being involved in making the film.
Well, yes, so I was approached by Hugh. I've been doing a bit of work with Leap Sports to help set up a trans and non-binary specific safe swimming space called Seahorses. So we were kind of in the throes of setting that up, and this was we filmed in December. So I wasn't actually long back in the pool myself, just going to the... so I work at the University of Glasgow, just using the University of Glasgow pool. So actually it's like September was my first swim in goodness knows how many years. So it was really amazing to do that, and then to think, well, yeah, creating this swim group, and to just... I thought it's important to discuss what it means to me, and then I think a lot of people can then draw from that their own experiences and what swimming or their own sports means to them. So it's kind of an honour to be asked and a pleasure to be in it. Actually, it's quite a bit of fun.
Good, that's great. And what about you, Lewis? Did you enjoy being part of the filmmaking process?
I was asked to take part because I was very interested in sharing my story about what it's like to be disabled and transgender doing disability sports.
That's really great. Chris, do you want to say something about why Sports Scotland decided to fund the film and what the importance of that kind of investment would have been?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I think if we're going to have a truly world-class sporting system, I think it's really important that we recognise that there's genuine equal opportunities for all. And one of the things that's come across for the film for me, and I've been scribbling some notes here, is it just makes us think about all the challenges that some of us perhaps, I've been involved in sport for many years, aren't actually aware of some of the challenges that these people have been through. And I think it's incredibly brave of them actually to be able to tell their story. And I think it's going to be a great asset, not just for Sports Scotland, but for the governing bodies, the film to use to hopefully educate others that aren't in this room, our clubs and the coaches out there, because there's many issues wrapped up in the film that have really got me thinking, and I think some of the other policymakers and the chief execs, and it's great to see some of the chief execs from the governing bodies here. We've got to go away and have a real think about this. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it very moving as well, actually, and it's got me thinking about how we can go the next step.
Yeah, and there's a resource that's going to be launched to go with the film to help sports organisations, governing bodies to actually, kind of develop policies and implement changes in the way that's useful and that provides a more inclusive environment as well. Okay, Jazz, do you want to say something about what you thought of the film and how that relates to sort of your experience of working with girls and women from BME backgrounds?
I mean, I think the film was really interesting. It resonated with a lot of the work that we do at Glasgow Life. We work with minority ethnic communities, and particularly with women and girls, and trying to engage them into swimming provision. And it's been a task and a half trying to get there, but a lot of the barriers and the issues that were there can be transferable, and you can recognise where the individuals are facing those barriers, but it's about making those small changes, and by making those changes we can actually make sport more inclusive for all communities. So for me, I think it was very, very powerful, and as Chris has said, I think it was very brave for the individuals to be able to tell their story.
Yeah, so that relates, I suppose, quite interestingly to a point that Pat was making earlier about sort of being proactive and not being, reactive in terms of trying to create a more kind of inclusive environment.
But it's also about, I think Pat had also said earlier on about it's not a one-size-fits-all approach as well, and it's about the sport. And in terms of stereotypes, again, we think that sport doesn't affect a lot of people. However, everybody wants to take part in sport. Everybody wants to be involved. And it shouldn't be about the individual themselves. It should be about the sport first and foremost. And the example that I'm giving is the women and girls swimming session, which we do. It's not particularly a sport that's associated with BME women and girls, but yet it seems to be one of the most successful programmes which we've run to date. So let's break down some of these barriers. Just because we think individuals may not want to do something doesn't mean that they don't want to be a part of something.
Yeah. Okay, we have got a little bit of time for some questions and comments from the audience. If you have a question for anybody here on the panel.
We have a roaming mic as well. Any comments? There's one back there, Paul.
It's more a comment on the kind of scale of the issue. I kind of work with young trans people who are transitioning at the Gender Identity Development Service. And just to kind of highlight the numbers, really, we now have 1,200 people a year who are being referred into our service nationwide. And I think participation in sport is something that it's been recognised today that there's, we need to do a lot more about participation of sport for adults. And can I just say that for young people under 18, that situation is even more necessary. There's less provision for young people. And when we speak to young people about their developing gender identity and we ask about what things do you miss, almost invariably it's things like swimming, participation in football, participation in sport in general. And often these young kids at school are not able to partake in PE because there's not adequate changing facilities. So I think it's great that we have an opportunity today to think about trans participation and diverse participation in sport in general. But I think we probably need to have a bit of a focus more on that at the kind of junior level as well as at the kind of senior and adult level.
Does anybody want to comment on that as well?
I mean, I think you've made a really interesting point, and there's a great danger that, we as sort of policy makers, if I call myself a policy maker, work for Sport Scotland, is we just focus on sort of broad areas without realising, there are some challenges within those. And it's great to see we've got two of our young sports ambassadors here along to the conference today, and I think perhaps that's something they can take away for the young people's sports panel to have a look at if that's a specific issue. So thanks very much for raising that. I think it's really interesting.
Do you want to add something to it? Today, young Sam, who was in the film, we previewed the film about a month ago, and he was able to be at that, and he was on a panel speaking at that. And it was really, he's only 14, and it's really interesting hearing him talk about his experiences because he's being so young and with his school and stuff like that. And it seemed, I met him initially, and he was kind of describing what was happening at school. And then by the time I met him, then he was talking about this stuff kind of happening, like when he mentioned about the rugby and stuff like that. And by the time that we showed it at the preview, he was saying that he'd been taken out of PE completely, and wasn't able to compete at all. His mum's here today, actually. Was that right? That was happening. Yeah. And so it's a pity Sam isn't here, he's at school today, but it's a pity that he's not here to actually to talk about it because he had some really interesting things to say, and he's really, really passionate about it as well. And he's a really interesting guy, and I just wish he was here to talk about that kind of stuff. And there's another question there, Paul. Just right in front.
Hi. Brilliant initiative. Loved the video, guys. Excellent. One of the things that I kind of just wanted to raise as a point, because we're talking about other groups, and the video is great, and I think it'll reach people in the community. I'm not certain whether it'll reach people who are outside the community, if this makes sense, when I'm talking about kind of like the trans community, because there's often this issue where our community kind of almost gets split into three sections. You've kind of got people who perhaps aren't transitioning very early days, who are questioning, etc. And then you've got people who are kind of in what I'd call the trans bubble, as it were, who are kind of going through transition, basically getting their life on track. And then you've got people who may have transitioned some time ago. And one of the things with messages, when we send our messages out, is invariably we don't manage to reach people who are in that third category. So it's how do we begin to reach that third category as well, as another group? How do we bring those people who've been through before, whose experiences are mandated by what they went through when they've transitioned, to be able to also participate?
Hugh, do you want to say a few words about sort of what we're trying to do with the film and kind of how we'll distribute it?
Yeah, I can't do anything other than agree with that. The purpose of the film is to use it as a training resource within the sports sector. So we've been quite specific about the audience that we're trying to reach. And what we heard from the training that we've been delivering over the last couple of years is that, you know, we're still at that 101 stage, as Pat talked about. We still need awareness. We need to hear what some of those issues are. And the Sports Scotland and EHRC report that came out in January this year underlined that quite clearly. Where things have moved on greatly around sexual orientation, as Martin demonstrated earlier, is still very much behind within the sports sector around trans issues broadly. So I completely agree with you. The real purpose of it for us is to try and inspire some of our sports sector colleagues who are here today to be able to take that film and use it within their own workplaces and within their own training. We'd be completely delighted if you wanted to keep paying us to come and train you forevermore. But we really want you to be able to take this and do some kind of self-directed action as well.
There's a question back there.
Hi, it's a great film. I'm actually Sam's dad, and I'm quite interested to know what the community feels about. It seems to me like sports, particularly in Scotland, are very siloed within the clubs and within the structures. And I'm very keen to see non-gender specific activities, frisbee, softball, dodgeball, these kind of activities that are team-based, that are so hard to break into, it's so hard to develop on a community level, particularly because of the silos, and it'd be interested to know how other people might feel about that.
Anybody?
That probably falls under my remit, I think. I think it's a really good point. I do feel that on the ground, out in many of the sports, that there is a lot more activity that's across the genders. I'm just thinking of sports like volleyball, which I participate in on a recreational basis, is very much mixed, and I think there will be other sport examples. Particularly think of jogging and running and cycling. I think what we tend to show on the videos and films when we're showing sport are competitive opportunities, and quite often high-level competitive opportunities, so there is a perception that it's very gender-specific. And indeed it is at competition, but from my experience in sport is that it's a better picture than I think sometimes we paint. I think it's something we need to be mindful of. I mean, there are a number of sports CEOs here today. I know Stuart Smith's here from Scottish Canoeing, and some of these sports do lend themselves to particularly at the recreational level. Anybody can do it. It's not gender specific.
And I suppose it relates to the point, Jazz, that you were making earlier about, and that Pat was making about it's not one size fits all sort of module, but that we need to sort of look at differences between kind of grassroots and recreational sort of sport and the higher level. I suppose the question is then how you sort of bridge that gap and how you, transition from the kind of grassroots context to the more kind of elite professional context, and where those boundaries, I suppose, might be is a question to think about.
I would probably also say it's also about role models. I mean, we've got these individuals that have come up today and they're talking about their experiences, but it's very much the same with the BME community. I mean, representation isn't quite high there, but without those role models, without individuals breaking through and actually saying, I want to do this, I don't think we're going to be in a position to make it inclusive. We need someone to stand up and say, I can do this, I want to do it. So where there's a vision, there's hope,
I mean, the importance of role models, is kind of known and well documented in all kinds of areas, whether it's in relation to female athletes or, BME athletes or whatever it is. So I suppose it's, again, sort of big thanks to you for, participating in the film and making yourself role models. I think it's a really brave and big thing to do. There's a question over there.
Hello, wonderful film, thank you. How would you kind of mitigate the problem of creating a safe space to get people into sport without creating a kind of an accidental segregation, as it were?
So, I mean, my thoughts are, I'm not developing a club for competition purposes. It is just a place for people, in this case, to swim, or I think there should be football clubs where there's no rules on what gender you are. It's just you're here to play football, a bunch of friends kicking around. So it'd be probably mixed teams. But in terms of preventing segregation, I mean, my thoughts, certainly in setting up or co-founding Seahorses, is to create a space to build people's confidence. So we have a swim meeting every last Sunday of the month, but it's 1 hour a month. I'm hoping that over time that the participants build that confidence to go swimming out with that group. I mean, personally, I go swimming at kind of my own local pool, and I try and do that like 2 or 3 times a week, and so helping build my confidence. And I just hope to spread that to other people. It's just having this open ability to participate then helps you integrate more, I think, not just in sports, but in general life as well. It's just, rather than segregation, it's safe spaces to build you to integrate. Yeah, a springboard.
Lewis, did you want to say anything about that as well, or are you okay?
Hi there. I thought the film was excellent. What I did notice is a lot of the examples are shown are clubs where it's team sports. Is there strategy or thought, or just in general your thoughts on things where people an individual just wants to walk into a gym and use gym facilities, or go along to a MetaFit class or a spin class? Is there a strategy for that being more inclusive, or just your general thoughts on how we can remove barriers to that as well?
I mean, in terms of the classes that you're talking about, I mean, we have a number of Glasgow sport facilities, Glasgow Club, and we know that we do have individuals that do come along. But are you referring to the changing aspect of it? Yes. I mean, what we do is we deliver a number of activities which are there. Again, some are mixed. You find single-sex provision as well. I mean, from working with BME communities, especially women and girls, we do actually deliver a lot of single-sex provision for women and girls. However, there are sessions that are out there. I mean, we've got a vast variety of activities which you could be looking up and being a part of. As Charlotte has mentioned, I mean, the swimming was a more specific one, I think, in terms of the attire being an issue and going into the pool and whatnot. And it's something we're hoping that we're going to pick up on, and we're going to make it something that's a regular thing. But I think we need to be realistic and we need to be honest as well, is that we're raising the awareness and we're aware of it here. I don't think it's something we're going to be able to change overnight. However, we've got to keep on working at it, and as long as we're doing something, and from a Glasgow Life perspective, I think we still need to learn a lot as well, and we need to learn from everyone out there and impart that knowledge. Only then will we be able to provide more inclusive facilities and provision. But open to suggestions if there's anything that you've got. So.
Freya in the film was talking about, who was doing the roller derby, was specifically talking about individual sports compared to team sports and stuff like that, and saying how, like, generally maybe that individual sports are a bit easier because you're just doing it by yourself, and team sports are a bit harder to get into. And obviously, yeah, it comes down to like smaller things like the changing room aspect, and that's why the film was called Let Me Be Brave, in terms of that's what everyone ended up talking about, was these actually, like, compared to everyone else, sounded like quite small things that like people were having to overcome, and so there's these tiny steps we're having to get over. But Lewis, I just wanted to ask you about, because you do athletics and football, don't you? So I know athletics is a team sport to a certain extent, but it's kind of individual compared to football. But I don't know if you wanted to say your experience of doing a team sport like football and then doing something as an individual kind of sport?
Well, I've been doing disability sports since 2009, and I joined the football team and I joined the athletics team as well. Before I transitioned, it was kind of easier, but it was kind of harder because I had to prove myself. But when I came out, it's a lot harder to be selected in football. I think my transition status is stopping coaches from selecting me. And with athletics as well, it's a team sport, but it's individual, as everyone's got their own abilities and strengths. And, well, for me, if I compete in the same category as athletes with the same running times or shot put distances. Yeah. I don't know what else to do.
Thanks very much. I know certainly that in athletics at a more participative level, they have competitions now where the 100 metre or the 200 metre heats are done on exactly that, are done on performance. So you could have a senior athlete who's running the same times as a junior girl, but because they're both running 30 seconds, then they're in the same heat. I think that's a really progressive move, and there's no reason why that can't be continued across, certainly at participation and club level.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final comment back there, if that's okay.
Well, just ending on a slightly positive note, I think I'm Sam's mum. Sam had a conversation with the Director of Education in Glasgow, and one thing that she did very much agree with was the issue about developing non-gendered changing rooms. And she said, and she's saying openly, that all the new build schools in Glasgow are going to have non-gendered changing rooms with individual cubicles and big spaces, and they're putting a lot of thought into that. And I think it's been a lot to do with the input from organisations like LEAP and LGBT Youth. So we're moving in the right direction.
Okay, so that's probably quite a good positive note to end on. Thanks, everybody, for participating in the panel. If you could just join me in a final round of applause for everybody involved in the film. Thank you. So the first speaker for this afternoon plenary is Dr. Matthew Waite, a senior lecturer in sociology from the University of Glasgow. He's also a member of the Glasgow Human Rights Network, and he'll get us kicked off for this afternoon.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be able to speak today. So my title is Understanding Diverse Identities in Queer Sexual Politics, and I'll come on to explain how I'm using that idea. I'm just going to say up front that in terms of my own identity, I would describe myself in different ways, but words I would use in relation to myself are gay and queer and genderqueer also. So that's part of the context in which I'm speaking. I want us to think about the terms, the words that we're using to think about identities. And I think for many people in society at the moment, and particularly for many of you who are practitioners and policymakers and people working or simply playing in the field of sport, this can be a central question for people. Questions about what do words mean, why are some people using certain words and not other words, and which words should I be using in order to communicate what I want to, which is that I'm sensitive and inclusive in my approach. So my central starting point in terms of how I would suggest responding to that is that the first principle really is to meet people on their own terms, that you seek to engage with people on the basis of how they self-identify. So a central issue is to establish what are the words that people use to describe themselves. But beyond that, what I want to suggest in this talk is that we're all engaged in an ongoing conversation about identity, about gender and sexual identities. And I think that conversation is becoming more and more complex. So beyond that, it's about finding forms of policy and practice that can be inclusive of that diversity, that growing range of gender and sexual identities. And I'd suggest that the social theorist Stuart Hall, one of our greatest social theorists in the UK, who sadly passed away quite recently, Stuart Hall suggested in his essay, Who Needs Identity, which you can find online, that identity is best thought about more in terms of processes of identification. So between our inner feelings and the words that we use to try and capture how we feel, there's an ongoing process of identification. And in a way, what Stuart Hall is suggesting is that that process is always slightly imperfect, that no word can ever entirely capture or match what we feel inside. So all of the words that we have come into existence in particular social and historical contexts. They all have histories, they all have contexts, and so our role and the role of people involved in policy and practice, and in fact of everybody who wants sport to be inclusive, is to find ways of speaking that allow for that complexity and that diversity. But beyond that, perhaps it's also about being willing to learn a bit more about different identities and to engage in an ongoing conversation. So if we start a sort of historical story, and if I try and introduce some of the key identities that exist in their historical context, we can see that in the early at the beginning of the 20th century, the word transvestite is coined by Magnus Hirschfeld. And here, sexology, the new science of sex, worked with a very strict gender binary, sex and gender binary, and also, in a way, sexualized that. So there was, in his book, The Transvestites, the subtitle was The Erotic Drive to Cross-Dress. So sexology as a science gave us a legacy which conjoins gender and sexuality in certain ways, which still influences in subtle ways how some people at least think about transvestism. Slide. Now if we skip forward to the post-Second World War period and think about the emergence of the concept transsexual, again this emerges in a medicalized framework where there's a very strict assumption of a gender binary. So the point I'm making is that this concept trans that we have has this association of transition, of movement between the gender binary. And initially this came in a very pathologizing way, and then through the work of Harry Benjamin moved into a more compassionate paternalistic approach. And the picture we see is Christine Jorgensen, who was the first person reported to have a sex change in the United States in 1952. Next slide, please. So let's just briefly mention the moments of resistance and politics that happened in the 1960s, including the riot in Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco, which the trans historian Susan Stryker has recently been working on and noting as a key moment of transgender politics and revolt. And then, of course, more well-known, the Stonewall riot in New York, which was subsequently labelled as the foundation of gay liberationism, but in which legendary trans activists like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were key instigators and formed an organisation called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Now, I want to introduce the feminist Kate Millett and her concept, sexual politics, into this story. So I think we need to think about sexual politics as a broad realm. And I think Kate Millett's work, where she understood sexual politics as a politics of sex, biological sex, and gender and sexuality, and she was using the concept of gender identity from the psychologist Robert Stoller in 1968 to talk about the politics of sex, gender, and sexuality in a context of patriarchy. So the context of gender inequalities and male power in society. If we skip forward to the beginning of the 1990s, we have the emergence of queer politics and queer theory, and perhaps the most influential queer theorist was Judith Butler, particularly in her book Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, in which she suggested that the ways in which we speak about and represent and imagine issues of gender and sexuality and biological sex are linked through what she called the heterosexual matrix, as what she called a grid of intelligibility through which we have been expected to understand these issues. So those of us who are outside the heterosexual matrix, for Butler, are the marginalised. But also importantly, this book raised the question about ideas of authentic identity. So whereas the sexologists of the early 20th century had understood identity often in biologically essentialist ways, theorists like Butler radically disconnect ideas of self and subjectivity from a biologically essentialist understanding. So I think what we're seeing in the present partly is that kind of understanding actually feeding into some cultural politics and some social experience and practice. So in the 1990s, we have the emergence of transgender politics, and this is when, it's only really from 1992, so relatively recently, Leslie Feinberg, in the essay Transgender Liberation, a movement whose time has come, was really the beginning of the idea of the transgender umbrella as a broad umbrella category encompassing transsexual, transvestite, and other forms of trans identity and identity outside gender dichotomy. And so we see in the approach of the Scottish Transgender Alliance currently the use of concepts of umbrella to talk about both trans and intersex umbrellas. For example, the intersex umbrella related to issues of biological sex and individuals who have the biological organs associated with both male and female in different combinations. So under that umbrella, there's the idea of intersex non-binary people, intersex men, and intersex women. So where are we now? What we now have is a new politics of sex, gender, and sexuality. So I'm just sort of floating the idea that we're in a period we could call queer sexual politics. So taking the idea of sexual politics from Millett as encompassing issues of sex and gender and sexuality. But the queer element, so queer politics and theory has been about disidentifying from heterosexuality and heteronormativity. And what we see is a vast proliferation of categories. On the one hand, labeling that which has been taken for granted as cissexual or cisgender, but also the emergence of a whole range of new categories like non-binary, intergender, polygender, bigender, agender, non-gendered. And we also need to think about the context of multiculturalism and people from different cultures who, for example, might identify as Hijra from India or travesti from South America. And then in relation to sexuality and romance, we can see how debates over asexuality have drawn apart ideas of sexuality from romance. So we have asexual but also aromantic, the idea of a grey sexual as sort of being in between being sexual and being asexual, ideas of being heteroromantic, homoromantic, pansexual like Miley Cyrus, and so on. So finally, to conclude, we are in a period of ongoing creative invention of new identities, which needs to be part of our conversation, as well as addressing more established identities. And so this calls for new ways of building alliances between different groups. And what I'm suggesting is that thinking about someone like Kate Millett can help us overcome some of the tensions in sexual politics between feminists and trans people, which seem to be very prominent at the moment. And we need to sort of think about more of a unified set of responses. But at the level of policy and practice, it's about meeting and engaging people on their own terms with a willingness to engage in dialogue, to be open to the multiplicity of identities and to use inclusive language that can allow for this diversity.
Out of 28 said they'd experienced persistent and physically violent bullying at school. And they were bullied not for gender variance, but for appearing physically different, for having a disability, or for being thought gay, and for not being good at sport. This was not perceived by the participants as overtly transphobic. All but one said they did not present as overtly gender variant at school. Rather, this was interpreted by the participants as homophobic harassment, except for the one. So starting with Helen, I extracted 4 to give a spread of age. Starting with Helen, who was born in 1947. Her father wanted her to go to Gordonstoun, but then found another school which was just as pleasantly harsh for her. And she talks about he wanted to get her out of her sissy ways. They would toughen you up with cold showers, but I didn't toughen up. I was no good at sport, and I think that was why I was bullied at school so much, because I was in the 6th form. I was only 13. I was much smaller and younger. It was a very sporty school. We had sport 2 nights a week and all day Saturday, and Sunday was church parade and army cadet force. I didn't cope. I was no good at sport. She keeps saying this. I was bullied, and one of the traditions of the school was the prefects, called chiefs, were allowed to discipline the younger pupils, and the school uniform was a kilt, and one of their favorite punishments was to get you into the gymnasium, stick your feet under the bottom of the wall bars, big beach ball on your chest, and you had to do sit-ups. And while you were doing this, they would lift your kilt and they would pee on you, and that was a form of punishment from the prefects at my school. And I'm afraid I was peed on rather a lot, and that's why I hated school. And I'm sure the teachers did know about the bullying, because a lot of them were former pupils themselves. But you just suffer these things and then it's over. It was a tradition, but you never told. So there's a narrative going through the interviews that teachers knew, and I'd just like to, when I wrap up, just make a suggestion or two about that. There's Karina, who was born in 1972. She's been on hormones for 4.5 years. She was post-surgery soon after I interviewed her. I never took any interest in football and all the boys' stuff. I wanted to play netball and girls' sport. The way my build was before, I think my testosterone was quite strong. I've always naturally built like that, but deep down I hated having muscles. At the same time, I would run away from myself. I used to do a lot of cycling when I was a teenager, about 400 miles a week. I would do a lot of cycling to try and prove I was this man, but actually I wasn't. I hated my body in every little way. I actually think because I hated my body so much, it helped me to fight back against the bullies. And Karina is one of the few who actually did get to fight back. I used to get bullied in primary school. It was mainly because I wasn't very masculine in terms of football or boys' sport. I wasn't interested in it. So I got picked on for that. No one protected me. So there's that theme again. And I remember I used to cry when I was bullied. At primary school, after a couple of years of getting bullied, one day I just had enough and I started to fight back. But it took a while, you know. I was doing the rounds, taking out the bullies one by one, bang, bang, batter their noses. I was crazy. I thought, how dare yous? And so that's she's reclaimed her agency eventually and empowered herself to fight back. Then there was Wendy, born 1965. There are definitely roles and expectations attached to gender, particularly in Scotland. So when I got to Glasgow, I was quiet and studious. That didn't seem to be an accepted male role model. Being lousy at sport and having absolutely no interest in sport was also another factor that's just absolutely wrong. A lot of the friends that I'd had in Dumfries were female, similarly in Glasgow, easier to talk to girls, and for some bizarre reason at that time got you marked out as being gay. And I never understood the logic in this, so I kind of didn't fall into any of the expected male patterns. There was a lot more bullying in Glasgow as a result, and there's definitely very much a very west of Scotland macho male culture that certain things are not acceptable. And there's a lot of examples now that I look back on. There's a lot of examples at secondary school. Secondary school was hellish. Wendy had always been there. Wendy is her female self from the age of 4. She'd always been a part of me in my head, so she was always there. But it was secondary school when she actually found a role that she was really good at. She kind of stepped in a lot more. So it made secondary school tolerable because I was physically bullied on a daily basis for about 4 years throughout secondary school. And you know, every morning, arrive at school, get beaten up. It was a good start to the day. And then Jessica, born 1987, she was the only one who said that she was bullied because it was transphobic bullying and because people identified her as transgender. This is a later era. As she said, it was about 2000 to 2006. I was the first male in my school to wear makeup. I'm 6'2" and I looked athletic, but I was no good at sport or football. People would spit on me. They would get a lighter and Lynx aerosol, do the flamethrower, try to catch my hair with a Bunsen burner. It was really crazy. I tried to tell the teachers. I managed to get away one time. And here, the teacher knew this was going on, did nothing for a long time, and the student got a punishment exercise. If I was the teacher, I would have called the police. So it was allowed. And this teacher in science one time said, oh, you're going to do the hydrogen peroxide test. You know what they use, that's what they use in your hair to make it blonde, referring to Jessica's hair. And the class went titter-titter, and I thought, that's great, give them ideas, let them tip that over my head. I didn't tell my parents because I was very embarrassed that I got bullied. I didn't tell anyone, and that's a common theme. So there was no one fighting for me in my corner except me. So the school just thought it best to blame me and then sweep it under the carpet. It was ridiculous. One of the last days I was at school, someone was upstairs. They were throwing glass bottles at me. They were smashing. I thought, you know, this has escalated now. The teachers couldn't seem to understand that it was everyone. It wasn't 2 or 3 people. It was literally the whole school, and I couldn't stay in the high school for my lunch. So he talks about walking home to go for lunch so that she wasn't at school to be bullied. And then she says at the end, no one cared, and bullying doesn't make someone stronger, it makes you hate them, and anger doesn't make someone stronger. So just to wrap up, recent research into the lives of young LGBT people in Scotland, not my research, this is other research done by LGBT Youth Scotland in 2012, found education is the environment where LGBT young people encounter the most discrimination. So this is still going on. The survey questioned 350 young people aged 13 to 25 about their experiences of being LGBT in educational establishments in Scotland and revealed that nearly 70% have experienced homophobic bullying in school, with rates reaching as high as 76.9 for transgender young people. While other forms of bullying reduced from school to college, the levels of specifically transphobic bullying remained consistent at 50%. And then there are initiatives to try and deal with this, and I just thought that this was discussed this morning in this conference, and I just thought, well, possibly this is something that could be thought of here. There's the UK-wide strategy advancing transgender equality, a plan for action. This is my last slide. Acknowledges the importance of support for gender-variant children in UK schools to protect them from bullying. Talks about children's early years have a profound influence on their lives. We know that over 70% of boys and girls who express gender-variant behaviours are subject to bullying in schools. There are various local strategies employed by schools and LGBTI Scotland. There's a national approach to anti-bullying for Scotland's children and young people developed by the Scottish Anti-Bullying Steering Group. And currently the Equality Act 2010 does not provide protection from gender identity harassment in school education. The Scottish Transgender Alliance and other transgender activist groups are currently campaigning around this, and that included the submission to the Transgender Equality Inquiry in 2015, the report of which has just come out. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. As I've said at the beginning, Sadie Godiva unfortunately can't be with us, but Sylvia is going to give her talk or read out a paper or whatever, which is really a sort of personal testimony sort of narrative around transitioning in lawn bowls.
Sadie Godiva has been a bowler all her life. She's introduced lawn bowls to Germany, and she recently transitioned. And in January 2016, Sadie Godiva sent the following question to bowling associations in Scotland, England, South Africa, and Australia. What is your policy concerning transgender bowlers? And she got a response from, she didn't get any response from Bowls Scotland, she got a response from Bowls England. And those of you who are involved in sport, this would mean something to you. I just constructed this presentation this morning, so forgive me if I'm not very fluid with it. I think this is the interesting, any male to female transsexual who underwent gender reassignment surgery before puberty will be accepted in Bowls as female. I don't know how many of you know anyone who has done that. I don't think there are many people who have. This also applies to individuals who've undergone female to male reassignment before puberty who will be regarded as male. With the exception of those highlighted in 2.2, only individuals who have acquired a UK gender recognition certificate are eligible for participation in their acquired gender in matches under the control of Bowls England. Equivalent documentation, etc. As some of you may know, acquiring a gender recognition certificate is quite a process to go through. So, Sadie wrote back to Bowls England, "Thank you for sharing this document with me. If I understand this policy correctly, this means that players whose situation does not conform with policies 2.2 and 2.3 will have their gender recognized as that assigned at birth. As a consequence, a male to female transgendered person may only compete in male events and or mixed events where she is regarded as male. Does this also mean that a male to female transgendered person will not be allowed to wear a skirt when playing? Which changing facilities will she be expected to use? Firstly, can I clarify by saying, this is a response, that as Chief Executive of Bowls England, it is my particular responsibility to deal with inquiries related to transgenderism. Are you, and then he asks a fair number of questions. Have you completed your transition? Are you undertaking gender reassignment? Do you have a gender reassignment recognition certificate? And Sadie then responds, "It's encouraging to know that I'm dealing directly with an individual charged with overall responsibility for transgender matters." And then she says, "I'm male to female transition, live part-time as female for nearly 3 years before becoming full-time at the start of October last year. I'm not in possession of a gender recognition certificate, and it is likely to be some time before I get one, as anybody who's been through that process will know." She talks about playing bowls for 25 years, and the point that she's making, the main point she's making here, "My concerns are not for me alone. I'm sure there will be other transgender individuals with an interest in the progress of my inquiry. Bowls England's policy concerning those in possession of a gender recognition certificate is quite clear. It's the area between the start of transition and obtaining a gender recognition certificate which needs to be addressed." Then from Bowls England, as you have now divined, not having a GRC in no way prevents you from playing Bowls England except in competitive sport. He says each individual inquiry will be dealt with individually, and one possible perspective on the situation is that actively transitioning within a club, either a club, I think this is interesting, either a club of which one is already a member or where a new club will be aware that the player is in the process of transitioning, is potentially more stressful for all involved than taking a break. As a player, while one gets either some way through or wholly through the transitioning process and then seeks a new club. I'm not advocating such an approach, but it is food for thought. Interesting. Now, this one, I hope I have time to go through this one because this one is really very interesting. She asked a question to Bowls South Africa. Bowls South Africa does discriminate against any persons, is the first sally. I wonder if the word not, she's in blue everywhere, I wonder if the word not is missing from your reply. If so, what sections, competitions, would a male to female transgendered person be allowed, expected to compete? Men or ladies? Which changing facilities would they be expected to use? What defines a transgendered person under Bowls South Africa rules policies? I look forward to your reply. Sorry, I misread your email. I thought you meant gay persons. We do not have any transgender players, so your questions have never arisen. Therefore, we do not have any rules re transgender persons. From Sadie, another shining example of misunderstanding and misinformation about the transgender community. Being transgendered has nothing to do with sexuality. Will Bowls South Africa be addressing this issue before a problem occurs? From Bowls South Africa. I come from South Africa, so this is, I can hear the cadences in the speech. I'm very sad to see your replies, as I'm not misinformed. I have a gay son married to a wonderful man. As a woman of 72, I recognized my son was gay at his tender age of 10. I have 2 cousins who are gay, so I was aware of the problem. As I'm trying not to... I mean, one has to try and sympathize with this person. As we have never had a transgender person apply for membership, we have not given it any thought, as I said. Please let this matter rest, as I do not need to enter into a dialogue with you. From Sadie, my inquiry is not about gay people, but you appear to have confused the 2 terms gay and transgendered. Will you be bringing this matter before the full board of Bowls South Africa for their consideration, or are you authorized to speak for the entire organization? And then we get the media officer involved, and it goes on. Number 4 is really good. I've been playing nationwide for 35 years now. Some people may be androgynous. Others may prefer to assume exterior gender change in private life. I can remember only one person, now dead, who enjoyed that orientation. And just the discourse, if you did a discourse analysis of this, it's very funny. Anyway, sorry, I've overrun my time. And... that's it. And she didn't get a reply from Bowls Scotland, who she thinks are very sexist.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I think obviously there's some really serious and problematic issues here, but entertaining nonetheless, I think. Hopefully with positive implications. Okay, we'll move on to the last speaker for the afternoon panel. Sonja Erikainen, who is a PhD researcher from the University of Leeds, and she's going to talk about intersex athletes. And I think she's going to go up to the podium.
Right. Am I short somehow? Okay, so thank you. So I would like to talk a little bit about the history of gender verification in elite sport, specifically with reference to intersex athletes or athletes who have disorders of sex development. So intersex and disorders of sex development are 2 alternative terms to describe bodies that don't kind of comply, if you like, with our conventional ideas of what male and female bodies are meant to look like. So what is gender verification? Well, until if you can I have the next slide? Sorry, thanks. Until very recently, sports governing bodies like the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, and the International Association of Athletics Federations, the IAAF, required that all athletes competing in the female category undergo testing to prove that they were indeed female. And this gender verification testing was only applied to female athletes. So systematic gender verification was begun in the late 60s, basically because of worries about kind of masculine-looking female athletes, so women who appear to be a bit too strong and muscular. So people worried that some athletes in the female category had unfair advantage due to what were thought to be masculine characteristics like increased muscularity, strength, and speed. So they were thought to have these masculine characteristics because they had male-like or actually male bodies, and they should therefore be excluded from female competition. Now, gender verification relies on the assumption that men are better at sport than women because they are stronger, faster, and so on. So it's because of this assumption that most sports are divided into gender categories, and gender verification polices this gender categorization to ensure that women don't need to compete with men or those kind of aching to men, whatever that means, who are thought to have a biological advantage over them in sport. But in practice, the result of gender verification policies has been that many intersex athletes or athletes who have disorders of sex development have been excluded from elite sport, or their sex has fallen suspect because they failed gender verification. I'll briefly talk about the stories of 3 athletes, which I've chosen because they are important for the history of gender verification, and I think they are the most illustrative of the kinds of problems with this idea. So the first story is about Maria Martinez-Patino. So in 1985, Martinez-Patino was excluded from female competition because she failed gender verification screening, which at the time was the IWF employed kind of chromosome test based on the assumption that chromosomes are adequate proxies for sex, right? So Martinez-Patino failed because she has XY, i.e. male chromosomes, rather than XX, i.e. female chromosomes. So the reason why she failed was that she has something called androgen insensitivity syndrome, which means basically that while she has XY chromosomes, her cells don't respond to androgenic hormones like testosterone, so she's biologically mostly female, basically. So, but Martinez-Patino, she felt that her exclusion from sport was unjust, you know, and she decided to challenge the gender test. So, with help from some scientists, she argued that her Y chromosome did not make her male, nor did it give her any male-like unfair advantage over other females, because her cells were unresponsive to androgenic hormones, testosterone in particular. So she argued that it is the effects of testosterone that cause the sporting advantage, so greater muscle mass, strength, speed, so on, that males are meant to have over females. But Martinez-Patino actually has less testosterone than most women because she's androgen sensitive, right? And therefore should not be excluded from female competition. And this argument was successful. It was accepted by the sport governing bodies. And the Martinez-Patino story is important for the history of gender verification because basically her argument grounded testosterone as the key for identifying sex for the purposes of sport. And testosterone has really kind of been the core focus ever since. So the idea is that the role of testosterone in athleticism is the justification for gender verification. And gender verification then is needed to guarantee fairness for female athletes because females have less testosterone. So that's the idea. You can have the second slide. So the second story I want to talk about a little bit is Caster Semenya, which is 2.5 decades later, basically. I'm sure you already know about her story because it was very widely publicized by the media. So in 2009, the IAAF ruled that Semenya did not meet the requirements to compete as a woman. There were no chromosome tests anymore, but Semenya was made to undergo some rather unspecified overall assessment of sex because suspicion was raised about her gender, presumably based on how her body looks like and how she presented her gender. So the IAAF never clarified why she failed to meet the requirements, but it was widely reported by the media that Semenya had elevated testosterone levels. So Semenya's story and the details about her body were made very public, and although her right to compete was reinstated eventually, this reinstatement came with rumors that she was made to have treatment to lower her testosterone levels. So the way in which Semenya's case was managed by sport governing bodies was widely criticized, and the IAAF and the IOC kind of consequently clarified their gender policies like straight afterwards and adopted so-called regulations on female hyperandrogenism right? So according to these new regulations, if a female athlete has hyperandrogenism, meaning elevated functional levels of androgenetic hormones, kind of due to which her testosterone levels are in the male range, then she can be either excluded from competition or treated, or has to be treated to lower her levels. So these regulations explicitly identify testosterone as the focus of sex in sport, relying on the idea that elevated levels bring kind of male-like sporting advantage. So the third story, which you also, I'm sure, know about, is the most recent. So in 2014, the new hyperandrogenism regulations were used to rule Dutee Chand ineligible to compete as female because she has hyperandrogenism. But quite like Martinez Patino kind of decades before, Chand didn't accept that her body was not female enough somehow, as it was, and she refused to get treatment to change her hormones. And with help from some academics, she argued that that should not exclude her from competing as female. So two kinds of arguments were made in Chand's defense. So firstly, it was argued that there is actually no evidence that high levels of testosterone is a significant determinant of performance in sport. Now, this counterintuitive claim idea was defended most strongly in an article published in the journal Science, which is quite highly renowned, which argued that hormone profiles from elite athletes differ from usual reference ranges. So while in the general population there is little or no overlap between male and female testosterone levels, in elite athletes there is overlap in both ways, right? So some male athletes have testosterone in the female range, as well as vice versa. Secondly, even if elevated testosterone does confer advantage, why should this be unfair? People asked. So elite athletes as a group have lots of various kinds of biological advantages, like mitochondrial variations in endurance athletes, for example, that confer exceptional aerobic capacity. So why should hyperandrogenism be considered unfair, rather than just another advantageous biological variation, basically? And these arguments were professionally successful, right? So in July last year, a 2-year suspension was issued on the hyperandrogenism regulations, which is now pending evidence of a quantitative relationship between elevated testosterone and improved athletic performance in hyperandrogenic athletes. So the relation between testosterone and athletic performance. So can I have the last slide, please? So what are the lessons then from this history of gender verification? Well, the core problem is that bodies are not clearly sexed according to a binary, despite sports leaders' desire that they should be so, right? So the foregrounding idea of gender categorization in sport and the starting premise for gender verification is that men have higher levels of athleticism than women, right? So women are meant to be weaker, smaller, and slower than men. So men have athletic advantage over women. Now, the idea that some women have unfair advantage over other women due to higher or male-like levels of athleticism requires for it to sustain itself that high levels of athleticism are identified as male-like or male attributes in the first place, right? So when it comes to testosterone is associated with increased musculature, strength, and speed, which again are attributes associated with men. So the idea is that if testosterone is the thing that makes men better at sport than women, an assumption which is, it's widely shared but questionable, right? Then women with male levels of testosterone must be considered, athletically speaking, male for the purpose of sport, right? But this logic fails, right? It fails in at least two ways. Firstly, it fails because it assumes male and female are mutually exclusive, and it fails because it assumes that the former is an athletically superior category, right? But male and female are not mutually exclusive. There is overlap between male and female in kind of every imaginable characteristics that is used to distinguish them. But even when we do think of male and female as separate categories, based on legal recognition, for example, men aren't categorically athletically superior. Lots of women are athletically superior to lots of men, right? Even at elite level, there is overlap between male and female resorts in most IWF sports, for example. So binary sex categories can't be sustained in the face of biological reality. And even if a woman runs as fast or lifts as much as a man, that doesn't make her male. Even if testosterone is shown to be a key determinant of performance in sport, this doesn't mean that women with high testosterone are athletically male somehow. They are simply women with high testosterone. To argue otherwise is to rely in one way or another on the idea that when women have characteristics that may allow them to be strong and fast, maybe as strong and fast as men even, they can't be fully women because to be a woman is to be weaker than men relatively. But high levels of athleticism, like high levels of testosterone, are not attributes reserved for men. So to summarize, the history of gender verification reminds us that sex is not binary, firstly, and it illustrates that when we try to draw a binary line on sex, we do this based on our cultural ideas of what male and female bodies are like and what they can do. So in this context, males are meant to be athletically advantaged and females athletically disadvantaged, relatively. When female bodies are thought not to be appropriately disadvantaged due to testosterone levels, for example, they are excluded from the female category to ensure that females as a category remain appropriately disadvantaged, right? So there is a ceiling above which women can't go, no such ceiling for men. So to conclude, to build sport that allows all bodies to exist and all bodies to excel, sex and gender difference can't be policed. There can't be an assumption of a ceiling, be it of performance or biological attributes, whatever, that one can't go over, in particular when that ceiling is drawn differently for different kinds of bodies. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you. That was really great. So in a way, we've ended with a bit of a problem. So on the one hand, we have sport as this sort of context or space that's absolutely built on, a kind of sex, gender binary sort of system, and then we have 3 or 4 kind of virtual people sitting here saying that actually the sex gender binary doesn't exist anyway. So try and I suppose our sort of challenge is to try to make that fit, or sort of try to find some dialogue, which I suppose is what the entire day is about. We have a little bit of time for questions, so can I just open it up for questions from the audience, or comments, or concerns, or respondents?
Sorry, my name's Eleanor Grant from Comic Relief. It was just an observation, particularly from Matthew, just a sort of around the kind of academic discourse and the language, which, I find, confusing, and I don't know how alienatory some of those terms are within that kind of environment. But I suppose, is there an easy way for those who are from outside those communities to kind of understand, or to kind of, are there kind of any helpful pointers? I know I recently received a glossary of terms from another event that I attended, and that was interesting but confusing as well. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's an issue that I'm struggling with in my own teaching as well, because in a way the resources don't always keep up with the debates in activism. I mean, what you find is a lot of it's not just academic writing. Actually, a lot of these terms are coming up through activism and cultural politics before they're getting into academia, and there's not that many people in academia kind of dealing with them. I mean, I'm trying to pick up on useful interventions in the media. So, for example, there was a debate on Newsnight between CN Lester, who's an intersex activist and musician, and a feminist whose name momentarily escapes me. But the debate was really excellent. You can find that on YouTube, and it sort of captured, in a nutshell, the sort of tensions between the feminist need to use categories to analyse gender inequality, and on the other hand the desire of a lot of radical trans and intersex activists to sort of move away from categories. So that's that. I don't have a book off the top of my head or a resource that sort of covers all those different categories. I think what you have at the moment is lots of literature that looks at one specific bit. So there's the sort of intersex stuff. So I'd say for intersex, look at organisation Intersex International is an international network with people like Morgan Carpenter, which has good resources on its website. For asexuality, look at the Asexual Visibility and Education Network, AVEN, AVEN website. For bisexuality, you can look for BICON. So there's, you kind of have to be looking around and piecing things together. So I mean, I think it's an area where maybe producing more resources that bring those things together could be a useful thing for a lot of people.
Any other questions? I suppose one sort of comment to kind of add on to that as well, and kind of to your question as well, is that on the one hand, there's a sense of kind of moving away from categories, but then we have, a whole list of lots and lots and lots of different new categories, and I suppose working out the sort of relationship between the kind of moving away from identity categories and binary identity categories and all those new kind of categories that seem sort of to be restrictive in some way as well, I suppose, is a challenge too. Sorry, there were just some hands coming up.
Hi. I'm Pia from Discover Football, Berlin-based women's, but also like trans open NGO, and we also run our own football club. So I have a question for Matthew. When you were talking about the ongoing problems or issues, I don't know how you phrased it, between feminism or like feminism being especially transphobic, I was wondering like what you meant, if you were like more referring to the beginnings of transgender activism, or if you were talking about like more recent occurrences. And I also wanted to make like one remark as to Sonja's talk. I like coming from the other end, like for like the last World Cup in Canada, there was also this gender test that the female athletes had to pass, and I mean, unfortunately, like in Germany, the coach, or no, I think the director of the national team actually said something like publicly, well, I'm proud to say that all our women passed, something like that, or that we could prove that they're all real women, and I found that a very sad remark.
Shall I respond? Yeah. In my experience, most feminists are sympathetic and supportive to trans people. What I'm gesturing towards is what I would say is the dominant media representation of feminism at the moment, particularly in the context of remarks by Germaine Greer, and kind of political tensions between her and many trans activists, but also someone like Julie Bindel, whose interventions over a number of years have been regarded as transphobic by many trans people. So I do see that tension in the media occupying a lot of space. So I think it's really important for us and for people involved in sexual politics to be looking for ways to move beyond those tensions and look for creative alliances. And I think Kate Millett is a resource for doing that.
I'd like to just add on to that point that Michael made, because I think sometimes we can underplay really what happens in the media, and when people like Germaine Greer make unhelpful comments. But just to give you some anecdotal evidence of how that can affect young people, there are young people come into our clinic who watch the news, 15, 16, 17 years old, and they're beginning to that are beginning to become politically active themselves, and there's a political awareness to them. And when Germaine Greer makes statements like, a trans woman cutting off her balls doesn't make her a woman, it's an unhelpful discourse. And I think that for young trans people to hear that from somebody in a high-profile public position, and for that to go unchallenged by the mainstream media, and it was down to the National Union of Students to kind of challenge her and to suggest that she should be no platformed. I think there should be more of a public responsibility to challenge transphobia as and when it happens. And I think Germaine Greer was a prime example when that didn't really happen in mainstream media. But it is problematic, because it does you know, the message that gives to young trans people, I think we shouldn't underplay it, really. We should take responsibility and challenge it as and when we see it.
I basically agree. I think my remarks were intended to sort of gesture towards those debate and say we need to do something creative to move beyond that. And I do think Germaine Greer's remarks are incredibly unhelpful, and I think she gets more airtime. But I think there have also been acts of resistance and, you know, letters published. But I think there's, also with recent debates about the NUS LGBT officer who decided she didn't want to appear with Peter Tatchell on a platform, partly because of Peter Tatchell's previous support for Germaine Greer. I think that is a legitimate decision for an individual to make, and I don't think Peter Tatchell's response to that was entirely helpful. But I'm also conscious that all these debates are occupying an awful lot of time and energy and are exhausting for a lot of trans people and people outside the gender binary, and there's a risk of reproducing the prominence of these figures of an older generation like Germaine Greer and Peter Tatchell, and actually what we also need to get some new voices into the debates.
I suppose that kind of relates to a more general sort of mechanism where, you know, the dominant kind of stays dominant by, positing marginalized groups against each other. And I think that's sort of partially, I think, what happens there as well, in terms of how that's played in the mainstream media context. Any other questions, comments? There's another one over there.
It was just another comment, I suppose, directed to Matthew, really, and it's just...
You are the boy on the panel.
From a black perspective, it's interesting and good that you've kind of noted Stuart Hall, but there is a lot of discussion within the sort of African-American communities, but also the British black female voice here in the UK. But it doesn't receive really much public attention, I guess, in the mainstream. But I just wondered, if what your kind of, if you've had that connection with those communities and that discourse, and what some of the messages or things were that are kind of emerging.
I think I want to create some space for some questions to the other speakers, so I'll be really quick. In the list of terms I flagged up, I was, by putting terms like hijra and Koti and travesti, I was kind of gesturing at the huge issues about thinking multiculturally and thinking internationally and globally about the huge range of different gender and sexual identities that exist internationally, and those don't just exist in other states because people are mobile. People are here in the UK and in Scotland, and in a group like LGBT Unity for asylum seekers and refugees, who I've been in touch with quite a lot in Glasgow. So, yeah.
It's probably also a good point just to sort of mention that, we are very aware that this is a very white conference and a very white event, and it's the event is called Diverse Identities in Sports, and we're addressing some diversity in terms of gender and sexuality, but certainly not all kinds of diversity that we could address as part of this conference. I think it's worth sort of pointing that out, even though it's not ideal that we've not been able to address that issue as fully as we might have wanted to. You have time for a final question or comment, if there are any.
I guess a question for Sonia, sorry. Oh no, sorry, the other one I meant. Sylvia, sorry. I'm sorry. I guess the question is about when you're going about a research project where you're sort of talking to trans people. It seems to me that because, I don't know if this is correct or not, but because trans issues are kind of coming up in the media, that there's an awful lot of people who want to talk to trans people and to sort of do research around it and things. I'm more on the filmmaking side of things, and I'd like to sort of represent trans identities more, but sometimes aware that it could be potentially exploitative. So how did you sort of address that, if at all? How did potentially what? Exploitative. How, as a researcher, how do you address sort of,
Well, I was doing my research through the University of Glasgow, ethics committees, things like that. So you have to go through a whole lot of procedures. So that's how it's accredited. In terms of exploitation, I discussed things like the questions with people, and then got their permission, to written permission. And then what I would like to do is use the stories in some kind of publication. And if that happens, then I'll go back to my participants and discuss that with them. And at each stage of the process, when I transcribed the interviews, sometimes they were 3-hour interviews. And I would transcribe the whole thing and then send it back. And people would edit it and then sign it off that that's what they'd approved, that was fine. And then if we go to the next stage where we make a book of it, then people will be involved in that as well, in that process. I don't know, does that answer your question?
In general, it seems in academia there's a lot of, I know more like in film and TV academia, there's a lot of people studying trans stuff now.
Hmm.
That many transgender people who are actually able to enter academia. It's quite limited. So it's kind of an imbalance.
It's an old question, isn't it? And Sandy Stone wrote her transsexual manifesto. I don't know. I started in 2009, and it's become much more of a popular topic now. Yeah, and I don't think that. I think it's important that there is independent research. I mean, I know there's a call for only transgender people to do research about transgender people, and I don't think that necessarily works. I mean, I do think that independent research is necessary. I identify as kind of agender. I don't really see gender as an issue. Yeah. There are trans people in academic spaces, though. I mean, there's some here today.
I mean, it's an important question, and it's sort of, a larger issue around kind of authority and power, knowledge, and, all those kind of issues that I think are really kind of important to think about, and important issues to, to address, which I think you have done. Is this still working? I don't. Working. There's probably a sign that we should wrap this up. So if you could join me in thanking the panel for a really useful discussion.